We invite the Prime Minister.
In a geopolitical context where we don't see the Indian government really relinquishing to the demands of azadi, where there is no indication of compromise from either party, we think this has ultimately resulted in a deadlock with no change ever being enacted. We think the fight for azadi isn't really representative of what the people of Kashmir want anymore. Because what they do want, Mr. Speaker, is for the fighting to stop, is to not be at the middle of all the altercations that has caused so much death, so much destruction. What they want right now is to stop being viewed as the aggressor, is to stop being viewed as a failed state and actually live within safe borders where they can be part of a prosperous state as well, right? We think opposition today needs to show us why the demand for azadi, which is what the Kashmir people are currently doing, is representative of what they want and why it is likely to actually fruition into some kind of change currently. Because on side government will be telling you why this isn't going to happen, why this isn't really favorable for them in the short or long term, and why we think a system of local self-governance is far more beneficial to them in both of these scenarios, right? So what exactly do we mean by the local self-governance over here, right? Now we want to move towards a more federalist approach within the state of Kashmir, wherein we see devolving more power to the bicameral structure that currently exists within Kashmir, which means that in the system of local self-governance, the state of Kashmir will be the first and last point of contact to pass any sort of legislative change, which means right now it's in line with some of the concessions that we already give to the state of Kashmir, but we want to devolve more autonomy in terms of the state necessarily requiring a majority approval from Kashmir before passing any legislative assembly, and also them being able to retain some degree of autonomy in terms of the kind of legislations they want to pass as well. And we'll be talking to you about three things in this scenario, right? Firstly, we're going to talk about why their demands for azadi are never likely to fruition in the current context that we're in. We're secondly going to look at what we think why azadi in the way that it might manifest is far more detrimental to the people of Kashmir. And thirdly, we're going to talk to you about why the benefits of local self-governance are things that the people of Kashmir also are showing indications of wanting. On the first issue, right, in terms of why we don't really think the demands for azadi are going to fruition. Three things. First of all, we don't really see India moving to a situation where they might actually relinquish and agree to the demands for azadi, right? And the reason for this is pretty simple. We think in a scenario where Kashmir does get azadi and get freedom, it's often likely to be allied to Pakistan, which means in a scenario wherein currently the conflict is confined within the borders of the state, in a situation where they do leave India and end up with Pakistan, we think the confines of this conflict isn't no more confined to these borders, but becomes one of an international issue and promotes further aggravation and further conflicts between these two states. So we don't think India wants to move to a stance where this is happening. But secondly, and what we find more problematic, is that often what we see today is that this isn't really representative of what people actually want, right? Which means that the demand for azadi, the narrative has largely been hijacked by separatist groups like the LET, who engage in violent methods to fight for their demands, right? And we think the problem with this is that the people of Kashmir are often caught in the crossfire, where they're continuously abused by militants, by Chinese armed forces, and by the army in itself. And we think this sort of an approach on part of the LET has triggered more expansion of the AFSPA, right? Wherein it was earlier confined only to the northeast, but we see this happening more even moving more towards Kashmir and acting in a manner that is far more aggressive. And what do we see today, Mr. Speaker? We see that they have the ability and right to be able to search and seize any property without getting a warrant first. They're able to shoot on first sight, which means that we see day by day the toll in terms of the number of people getting caught in the crossfire is ultimately high. But thirdly, we tell you the Modi government is not really likely to engage in this sort of diplomacy and engage in terms of giving up, pandering to their need for azadi, because what we see is that they want to move towards a more pan-national identity, right? Restoring Hindutva at its core, which means at the point at which they do fight for azadi, any negotiation that the Modi government does indulge in will be through the lens that is largely jaded as viewing Kashmir as a predominantly Muslim state in the event that it does side with Pakistan, right? And we think the problem with why they won't do this is because they think that any concession given to such a group of Muslims is necessarily going to be seen as a weakness and a fault within the government, right? And we think the perception that the Modi government wants to keep intact over here is that they do have some control over Kashmir and they want to keep it in India. And I think the problem is that earlier in the Vatsaah government, even though they did try to engage in some sort of diplomatic measures in trying to solve the conflict, the current government thinks that since it didn't really end the conflict over there, that those sort of methods are likely to fail and not something that they want to engage in either. Before I move on, yes.
So, do you think if you get local self-governance, this is not a narrative that you believe?
Yeah, sure. We do think the narrative is going to change, right? And we'll talk to you more about this in the last part of our argument. But moving on to what we think the people actually want. Now, we need to understand that in today's context, the leader of state that was elected by the people of Kashmir was one who was endorsed by the BJP, right? And we've seen indications where people do believe that change can come from actual legislative turnout. And we saw a voter turnout of close to 75%, which means that people are more willing to engage in tools of democratic change. But secondly, let's take a look at what we think azadi is likely to look like. Now, we see two scenarios happening, Mr. Speaker. First, where it does become an independent state of its own. In this scenario, we see that this results in a huge power vacuum, which is likely to be filled up only by more separatist groups and terrorist groups like the LET. And we think the issue with that is this. We think this further widens the demographic divide that exists between the Kashmiri Pandits and the Kashmiri Muslims, because Kashmiri Pandits were earlier seen as a group that was really privileged in society and was accorded some sort of a special status. We think the LET group that is likely to fill this power vacuum is fighting for an independent Muslim state, which means that they're not really going to consider what the interest of this group of Kashmiri Pandits is likely to be. But on the second, we think what's more likely to happen is that they do become a part of the Pakistani state. And in this scenario, why it's particularly problematic for the people of Kashmir particularly is because we think that they would be at the border of constant altercation that already exists between India and Pakistan, right? We see that there are already border issues that exist with regard to Kashmir and India. We think this becomes further aggravated. But why we think a local system of self-governance is far better is because, first of all, we think that there are already certain concessions given to the people over here that people from other states can't buy land and property in Kashmir. But we think being part of the larger union and still being able to contribute to the economy and functioning of the state benefits them. But secondly, we think this changes the narrative in that AFSPA and the armed forces no longer look at them as necessarily an aggressor or no longer look at them as a militant group, but see them as being part of the Indian identity as a whole, right? And we think we break away from this homogenization that currently exists, which is what is prompting more military action on part of the army. But thirdly, we think a large part of the reason why Kashmir is the way it is because of huge problems in the way their economic situation currently is, right? Which means that it is being seen as a failed region because of the kind of insecurity and instability that is necessarily going to exist insofar as they continue to fight for azadi. We think we promote more investments and more groups to come in and set up trade routes and actually cause the economy to grow in a situation where we overturn this violence and actually give the people what they want, which is a system of local self-governance, which is far more beneficial for them. For these reasons, incredibly proud of them.
Mr. Speaker, it is appalling that on the day of Independence Day, when we are supposed to celebrate local self-governance and all of the principles that it espouses, it is shameful that a debate about what Kashmiri people want has no engagement from side government on what actually Kashmiri people want and what are the ways that Kashmiri people function in, what are the historical operations that Kashmiri people are subjected to, and how it's impacted the way they prioritize things now, right? And all of those are things that we're going to give you now. We think that Kashmiri people are people who have been subjected historically to a lot of protection, right? We believe that they were at no point of time actually an equal part of India. We think that because of Mughal expansionism, Akbar took them into the world, right? And they were brought into this Mughal Empire, and this identity was then thrust upon them that they did not personally conform to. Then the Sikhs brought them in their fold, and they became part of the Sikh Maharaj, and again an identity was thrust upon them. Subsequently, we have the British thrusting their identity of like British imperial power, like British Empire, and this identity is thrust upon them, and they don't really conform to it, right? When we tell you that finally they're sold to Hari Singh by the British for an amount of money and 6 votes, we don't mean that they conform to the idea of being like of conforming to the identity of the empire of Hari Singh, right? It's inherently still see themselves as Kashmiris, and that's something that does not change, right? Even when the instrument of accession gives that transfers Kashmir from Hari Singh to India, Mr. Speaker, they do not conform to the idea of being Indian. They do not conform to the identity of Indianness, and that's something that they do not try to account for at all, right? Let us try to understand this notion in that kind of a context, right? What happens now? We think that the right to self-determination of Kashmiri people is something that they really, really value, right? And we think this is something that has been evidenced by recent events as well. When they come up and say that way the BJP has, like, oh, the Kashmiri people have elected a government, elected chief minister, that means not by the BJP, and therefore they are showing like likelihoods of change. We think that's like just manipulating facts, right? We think that the BJP and PDP alliance happened as a political necessity and a makeshift alliance. What in fact that's indicative of is the fact that the Kashmiri people want PDP in power, right? What is PDP? PDP is someone that is being sympathetic to Kashmiri separatist causes for decades and centuries, right? We don't think that that's the idea that they can run away with. But what does that also depict? That depicts the idea, like the possibility of the BJP and Modi of engaging with this Kashmiri separatism, because they are the ones who endorse PDP, right? Which is why like their argument is like topples over on their head, right? Let us talk about right now. Mr. Speaker, let us talk about this identity that has been thrust upon them. What are the ramifications of this identity? Because of the fact that they do not conform to this idea of being Indian, of being Indian, they are faced with a lot of backlash in reality. How does that backlash function, right? You believe in the narrative of mainstream India, the narrative that exists about Kashmir is that of a rogue state, is that of a separatist state, right? This idea of separatism as opposed to asking for your independence is something that doesn't go away on that paradigm, right? We don't think that local self-government is the solution for that, right? We believe that as far, for instance, like military violations are still going to continue, because we don't think that Pakistan's only incentive in like committing cross-border violations in India is just like, hey, Kashmiri people want it, right? We don't think that's it's as simplistic as that. We think China has shown itself to be more expansionist in general, right? They go about like including into territories that do not want them in the first place, right? They're trying to make like cross-border violations into Arunachal Pradesh. They're doing the same with Kashmir, and Pakistan will continue to do the same, right? There's no analysis as to why that's going to stop. In that kind of a context, why is ASFA going to go away, and why are the harms of all of those things related to it going to go away, right? We believe that, Mr. Speaker, we believe that there's been simply no analysis to show that. But Mr. Speaker, let us try and understand what the implications of statehood are on our state of the house, right? We think, Mr. Speaker, the problem with status quo right now is that Kashmir legally, economically, and for a number of reasons is a grey area. In the sense that when cross-border violations happen in Kashmir, there is nothing that you can do about it, as opposed to like just engaging with the military, because it's not a sovereign state. It's not part of India as well, because UN does not recognize India's claim over Kashmir, because it did not satisfy the instrument of accession like subclause where you ask for a plebiscite, right? Because of the fact that there is increased international pressure on India to satisfy that again adds to the point why BJP might engage with those demands, right? But this is our principal argument, right? We think even in the event that BJP does not, or like whatever government in power in the longer run comes to power in India, chooses not to engage with these demands, we think that these are demands that Kashmiri people hold valuable and think that they are entitled to, right? We think that there is no like possibility of like change, like prioritization or like giving up this demand just because they won't engage with it, because this is a right that they hold as inherent, as precious as you analyze it to be, right? This is something that they have not clash with at all. But what are the implications of statehood? Implications of statehood is that the economic situation that there is in your country is something that betters. How does that better? Let us try and understand what they tell us. They tell us that economically you're very, very poor and you're going to be worse off. Let us try and understand the implications of being a state and being a different state in yourself, right? When you're a state, a lot of your subjects are still subservient. Even when you're a local self-government state, a lot of your subjects are still subservient to the central government's whims and fancies, right? For instance, the fact that even despite having three different rivers and immense potential for hydroelectric power plant that can be tapped into, it's not tapped into, right? Because like because of central discretion and central governmental discretion, these rivers and the power from these rivers is redirected to three different states, right? And that's a problem. Because of the fact that you have rich uranium deposits that you can possibly tap into, but because of these cross-border violations, because of the hostility that in generally exists, you cannot tap into that. Because of the fact that you in itself are potentially like have the potential to generate huge amounts of revenue in terms of tourism. But because of the fact that the media and the narrative that is shaped by the Indian mainstream, because of this perception of Indianness that is imposed upon you, that the Indian mainstream is incentivized to conform, that the Indian mainstream by the narrative, this unilateral narrative that is peddled by the media, because Kashmiri people do not have a stake in this narrative, right? We tell you at a point at which in 2009, when like Kashmiri people asked the Tribune to send journalists to Kashmir and cover like indigenous local stories and try and understand their side of the story. Because of this rogue state narrative, because of this violent Muslim terrorist narrative and this all that we do, like that kind of a narrative, people just refuse to go there, right? We tell you in that kind of a narrative, the tourism also something that usually suffers. Why does that change when you become a state? We think when you are a state, you have the legitimate right to knock on the doors of the United Nations to say that they are sovereignty is being breached by XYZ nation. Right? We don't care if it's Pakistan, we don't care if it's China, we don't care if it's fucking India, right? Because our sovereignty is breached. Because it's something that's recognized as a universal principle. You have the responsibility to protect us, right? And we believe that that's something that they have not taken into account. But Mr. Speaker, let us try and understand what they did give us. They come up and tell us, firstly, that what do Kashmiris want? Okay, what do Kashmiris want? We don't think, Mr. Speaker, the Kashmiris want just end of struggle and like at any sort of cost. They want their identity to be theirs and not an identity imposition on them. They want sovereignty, they want local self-determination. They don't want to be viewed as separatists but as freedom fighters. They don't want to be viewed as like people who just bastardize and they just want to fight against the Hindus. In general, we think, Mr. Speaker, that for far too long Kashmiris have been oppressed, and this is something that we should never do at the earliest. For all of those reasons, we're very, very proud of this.
Mr. Speaker, at no point did side opposition explain or give us a mechanism as to how Kashmir will be allowed to exist as an independent state, right? Because we tell you the area is very, very unstable, right? We tell you it's almost as bad as some of the worst parts of the world, right? Say the Gaza Strip or any such area, right? And we tell you, what do we know about what Pakistan and China want, right? Let's analyze these three things: what China wants, what Pakistan wants, and what the people of Kashmir want, right? We tell you, when Kashmir was being, when there were negotiations with Nehru about including Kashmir into the Indian state, right? The people of Kashmir said exactly what the LO today came out and said, right? That their right to self-determination still exists, that they want to exist as the Kashmiri people, right? We tell you the same people today are crying or dead, right? Because they've been shot not just by the Indian army and pellet bullets, but also by insurgents and militants who don't really care who they fire at as long as the violence continues, right? As long as the instability continues. We already know that China will continue its expansionist policies because it doesn't care about India. It doesn't care about what the World Forum says, right? And we tell you, when Kashmir, what will happen when Kashmir becomes azad, right? We tell you, the Indian army will have to pull back, and at this point there will be no manpower, there will be no military to look after the people, to look after the borders of Kashmir, right? There's no way they're going to be able to defend themselves from the left and the right? Even if we leave them alone from the bottom. And we tell you, that is the most basic problem, right? They have to come up and hear and explain why suddenly we can build hydroelectric dams when the people can't even have basic infrastructure like hospitals, right? And like no company, no investor will ever go into Kashmir because Kashmir will not offer any return under status quo. In fact, tourism is also reducing because even the idea of traveling to Kashmir scares people, right? Scares people about their life. And that is why we need the Indian army and the Indian government to maintain peace and stability within the region, right? So we tell you, who is capable of giving Kashmir even a sliver of hope or anything that they might, a small slice of pie of the whole thing, of whatever they want, right? We tell you, only the Indians are capable of doing this, right? And we aren't going to do this by imposing our identity on them, right? The Indian media is biased, yes, but the Indian media doesn't fire the bullets that kill the Kashmiri people, right? We tell you, the conflict exists between 5 or 6 different parties, right? There's the army, there are the militants, there are the people, there are the pundits, there are the Muslims, and everybody is getting caught in between the crossfire, right? And what is the main problem in this area? Why is the army so inefficient sometimes, or so badly blamed sometimes, right? I'm not going to take a PR from you guys because you don't take any, right? So what happens here? We tell you, the problem is that the Indian army often sees the Kashmiri people as a separatist force in itself, right? And this is the narrative that creates the conflict that destroys or dilutes the idea of protecting them as a people who are autonomous but also a part of India, right? We tell you, this narrative will only start changing when the Kashmiri people finally concede to allowing India to continue to maintain a little bit of peace and stability, while at the same time giving them a chance at autonomy under the Indian government, right? And we tell you, they don't have to be subservient to everything India wants. we will give them their own prime minister, right? It can be exactly like the United Kingdom is, right? Where Scotland has its own prime minister or leader of state, and they maintain their own economic and geopolitical policies, right? We'll do the same thing in Kashmir. The only thing we will be responsible for is one, ratifying or maybe agreeing to the demand of Kashmir of what they want to do, like of what they want to do within the area, and two, protecting the people of Kashmir from the same militants who have created the instability within the area, right? Because what is causing the divide, right? The two things that affect the army the most within these areas and make them so inefficient is the idea that the Kashmiri people are contributing both to the numbers of the separatist groups like the LET and the legitimacy of the separatist groups such as the LET. And this idea was exacerbated recently in the news when a militant leader died, right? And we tell you a lot of people in Kashmir came together to mourn for this person. We tell you the Indian army necessarily misconstrued this as a finger to their work in Kashmir, right? And we tell you they have done a lot of work because nobody else goes within these areas. Who builds the infrastructure in Kashmir? It is the military. Who protects these people during the harsh winters? It is the military. And we tell you the only way Kashmir will ever exist as they want to exist, right? The ideal that they want is when they are a part of India. Before I move on, yes.
Does Scotland want to be a part of the EU?
Abhi, yeah, there's a whole new debate. That's not the point I was trying to make. Fine. So we tell you they don't necessarily have to conform to the idea of being an Indian, right? We tell you they have been historically subjected to oppression. Also shit you are. But what we tell you also happens on our side, on their side, right? Is that the separatist identity is again exacerbated to the point where the root cause of the problem never goes away, right? Both sides here, neither side here can prove to you that one side is necessarily has the solution to all our problems, right? What we can give you is percentages as to where it is more likely to lead to some sort of negotiation, right? They came and spoke to you about international pressure, right? The only way India ever reduces this international pressure is when we agree to that subclause and give them their own leader, right? Give them a little bit of autonomy. But also the human rights violation that happens in these parts, right? The only hope of these going down, right? And the only hope of the Indian army not being struck out or called out as often on the international stage happens when the Indian army sees the Kashmiris as their own, right? We tell you that only happens when the Kashmiri people come together and decide to concede to a few demands by the Indian government, right? Because we tell you the Modi government just won't let it happen because the Modi government came into power on the idea of control. They succeeded, the government was extremely weak in the minds of the Indian people, and we tell you there is no way they will ever concede Kashmir to being a part of their own state, right? But also what do the Kashmiri people want, right? And this is a very grey area. But and we can't really answer this because there are multiple demographics. But what we can tell you is that these people want the violence to stop, right? These people want to live a better quality of life. These people want economic growth in the region of Kashmir. These people want to lead normal lives where they can walk out of their doors without the fear of being shot, not just by the separatists, but by their own Indian army, right? And they don't see the Indian army as their protectors. They are seen as oppressors. We tell you this narrative doesn't change when the Indian army withdraws because the Kashmiri people will get completely screwed over by the dual forces that exist on either side. We tell you this will only happen when the Kashmiri people accept the Indian army, when India concedes and comes to the negotiation table, and the Kashmiri people concede and come to the negotiation table. And for all these reasons, we're very, very proud to propose.
Mr. Speaker, even if we assume this debate is as narrow as what do Kashmiri people want, and hey, they want an end to their violence, they need to tell us what does this violence stem from, right? And their only response to that has been the removal of ASPA. We don't think A, that's the reason of the violence, but B, we'll talk about what if it's only the ASPA. What do we think? Like the ASPA comes in, right? A, insurgency, and B, because the people wanted a separate state, which helped them, which is why they even agreed to some extent to facilitate the insurgency process, right? So what happens, right? if you have like the AFSPA and like what is the distinction that we're trying to make today? We think the reason a large number of people continue to fight despite years of oppression is simply because they want an independent state, and the response of the Indian government in this situation is to send in the military, right? And we think their analysis is a little faulty, right? Because they seem to view AFSPA as the cause and like violence as the effect. We think no, right? The AFSPA came in to solve the sort of violence that was happening in the Kashmir Valley. Why did this violence get exacerbated? Because Pakistan recognized an opportunity in a valley, recognized a cause that the Kashmiri people wanted, and therefore sent in insurgents, which the Indian government sought to control. We think the long-term solution to this, something they absolutely failed to address, right? The long-term solution is to give the Kashmiri people what they want. So they have no reason to support military insurgency, right? So there's no reason for the Indian government to send in the AFSPA. But additionally, if they're a free state, the Indian government can't send in the AFSPA even if it wants to, which we think under their model of like local self-governance, they still can upon their being discovered two insurgents, right? Because then it's a challenge to Indian sovereignty. We think this notion of sovereignty is something they absolutely fail to understand. And they do this like weirdly slimy thing where they say that Kashmir is going to determine every move that happens to them. We think the moment you are part of India, right, India can always claim a breach of its territorial sovereignty and therefore say we have to go in to protect our boundaries. We fail to see the long-term solution from their side because till the point at which you are part of India, the Indian government has every excuse of breaching its sovereignty and can act accordingly. Doesn't solve the long-term problem. But rebuttals. First, what do the people of Kashmir want, right? Classic paternalism. We tell you what they want, we know what they want, right? And we tell you, hey, the fact that they fight for so long is proof of the fact that they don't just want like this violence to end, right? Because if that was their ultimate aim, why would they still be fighting, right? They'd be like, okay, I'm fine with whatever. We think the Kashmiri identity is so deeply entrenched in the minds of the Kashmiri people that some things are more important to them than the loss of their lives, right? And to this, their response is that, but hey, so what, right? Even though we're the people of Kashmir, so what? The Indian government's never going to give it to us, which is why we should suddenly go down on our demands, right? We think there's a problem because you're like losing out an identity that you've fought for generations. We fail to see how as the Kashmiri people we could reconcile ourselves with this idea, right? But on the idea of, hey, the Indian government won't ever give it to us, we challenge them on that. We think the fact that continuing insurgency, continuing militancy, the fact that the people of India have finally recognized that Kashmiris want a free state is enough of an incentive for a government like the Modi government to recognize the sort of violence that happens in the valley, right? And to recognize that there's an alternative that needs to be proposed. We think the spur of violence that happens in recent times and the government recognizing it is the sort of idea that we wish to see and we completely fail to see. We think the Indian government will not do it is not enough and they can't get away with that unless they tell us like why exactly the Indian government won't do it when the people of Kashmir are slowly representing themselves in the electoral process through things like the PDP and the Indian government is being forced to agree to it because the BJP wants a presence in Kashmir and their alliance is with the PDP. So the PDP does exert that sort of influence and the PDP is essentially a party that has like consistently claimed for azadi. Tell us why in this situation the PDP can't exert the sort of influence. But if they want to like debate the semantics of how this is going to work, we tell you it's partition but on a more nuanced form, right? For the simple reason that you divide equitably the resources that you have to the extent that a hydroelectric power, which is by the way presently being taken by the Indian government and redistributed to other states, is the property of the Kashmiri state. It's simply given to them the fact that they have enough resources, right? Things like wood, saffron, hydroelectric power, wind energy, all of which are presently used by the Indian state without giving them the benefits to the extent that Kashmir presently has huge power shortages, but the rest of India is working fine on power that's generated from Kashmir. This is how partition works, right? And this is how azadi is going to work if they want to debate like the technicalities of it. But on the fourth idea, right, they tell you that everything done like it is going to be viewed as like a concession given to Kashmiris and therefore it's never going to work, right? We think this gets exacerbated the moment you have local self-governance, right? Because every sort of concession you make to them, every right that you give to those people is again viewed by the Indian populace as another concession made to like a state that has given you nothing back in turn, but in fact is actually taking away more and more from you, right? We think this sort of concessional value only ceases when you have self-autonomy, when you have sovereignty, and people can't question like, oh, what are you giving them because they're their own country, right? We think they fail to engage on that idea entirely. But fifth, right, what happens to like peace and stability in the long term, right? But before that.
Ma'am, how do you come to the how when we tell you that Pakistan is able to gain legitimacy by hijacking the narrative of freedom that the Kashmiri people call for?
Perfect, right? Because I just said Pakistan. The idea is that what has happened in Kosovo, right? To understand the repercussions of having an independent state, right? Which means you have recognized territory, you have a fixed population, and third, you have international recognition. The fact is, India isn't presently on a state at which it can justify why there is violence in Kashmir for the simple reason that they were supposed to have this plebiscite. The moment India does what it is supposed to do in the international eye, Kashmir can say that there has been a violation of their state sovereignty. It can appeal to the United Nations, it can appeal to this multitude of bodies in order to say that we're being invaded, this is war, right? Because we're a sovereign territory and no Kashmir, no Pakistan, no India, no China China can invade our territory. And we think here's the difference. We're not debating status quo versus local self-government. We think it's azadi versus local self-government that we're debating. And we think in the context of azadi, here's a more long-term solution, right? Which brings me to my final idea, right? What is going to happen to insurgency? We think even if you have local self-government, for the simple reason that Pakistan believes Kashmir is our territory, we don't see an end to them sending in insurgents as long as it is part of India, simply because it is disputed territory. How does this, is way better off in our paradigm, right? For the simple reason that Pakistan isn't going to have this sort of, this is our territory, because simply because they're a free territory. But even if they wish to send in insurgents, Kashmir has recourse in a way that it doesn't at present, because as they tell you, everything done in Kashmir is now viewed as like, a concession given to them or ASPA sent in. We think the moment you're an independent nation, you build on your resources in the same way that like Pakistan has, right? And you appeal to international bodies to give you the sort of support that in the short term you never can, because there will always be insurgencies. And we think Kosovo is the best example of this, how you look at identities of people and give them a state, and how they're far more successful than what they were when they were under Serbia, right? So what have we told you today, right? The fact that even if you continue to remain within the Indian state, there's this idea, like a different narrative regarding what the people of Kashmir are, and we think the people of Kashmir have suffered from it. The fact that media has portrayed Kashmiris as a bunch of people who don't want to be a part of India, which means that even when you are continue to be a part of India, this sort of narrative of hatred that exists against the Kashmiri people, is that something we as the Kashmiri people would never want to be a part of? Why would we feel like second-class citizens in a country in which we believe we don't even identify with? Why would we agree to this sort of narrative that is constantly channelized, and every concession given to us is viewed as exactly that? View this in the paradigm of a free state, right? But even if there is initial struggle, and we don't think there will be, right, because they're already in such a bad situation that things can only get better because they have the resources, we think ours is a better paradigm. Second idea, right? That our interests do not allow us. We think exactly, right? The idea is that our interests don't align with those of the Indian state to a great extent, because they refuse to identify with our identity as such. We think that our interests can align with whoever it matters, but the point is a long-term solution, which they also agree is necessary, lies in getting a peaceful nation, and we think this can only happen when you're a sovereign state, protected by sovereign ideals of international law, and for all of these reasons, very well.
Somehow magically when Kashmir becomes an independent state, can appeal to the authority of the United Nations and bank on the United Nations to protect it from all kinds of threats that exist. Let's take an example that happened recently in the past, right? The example of Russia invading Ukraine, right? Everyone appealed to the United Nations. US didn't send ground forces there because the United Nations doesn't have the mandate to do that. Russia currently has control of Crimea, and nothing has changed because Russia doesn't care about the public perception or the international perception that exists. Guess what? According to their own logic in their first speech, they also talk about another country that doesn't care about public perception, that is insurging into the Kashmir, which is China, right? Which is the example of how China engages in a go-getting atmosphere of going into the north and the south and the East China Sea and getting what it wants, right? And it continues to be a part of the UN Security Council that decides whether you should actively engage in a mandate to stop insurgency in these states. Understand that you can never appeal to the United Nations as a small, tiny state like Kashmir to protect and bank on your protection. That is absolutely untrue, and I don't see how that flies in this debate. That's untrue. That hunky-dory characterization of the United Nations does not work, right? But they gave us a challenge. They told us that we need to prove how violence will be solved under our paradigm, accepted. Understand this. They claim that as long as the people of Kashmir continue to fight, there is some hypothetical principled stance that they're taking, which is better. Understand that there are tangible harms to this. For example, people dying. Because the ASPA will continue for time immemorial till the Modi government or any government comes into power, and altercations with the LET will continue. What is the consequence of this? More violence at the ground and people dying. Right? It's a tangible harm of more deaths. How does self-governance solve this? Understand that the current perception of the army of the people is something that is homogenized as all of them are separatists. What does this mean? It means that people of Kashmir want to take a fundamental part of the Indian territory away from India. A philosophy that the Indian army is principally against and wants to protect it. Now, when the people of Kashmir engage with the government and accept that pan-national identity and continue to retain their autonomy over these things, because of the policy that we gave you of the bicameral structure that exists in Kashmir, we think that in this case the army will see them less as people who are separatists and more as people who want to be protected from insurgents groups like the enemy. How does this exactly solve violence, right? Because now the army doesn't see all of Kashmiris as separatists who want to move out of the territory because they already have agreed to be part of the larger Indian Union, but they now see specific terrorist groups like the LET fighting against the Kashmiri people in general and dividing them based on an ethnic violence that they need to solve, which means this now redirects the effort of the army from fighting against the entire homogenized Kashmiri people to specifically insurgent and terrorist groups like the LET who hijack the narrative of what the Kashmiri people want in this case. The reason why you have the entire debate about Irom Sharmila in this case is because she doesn't take a stance on anything about what Arunachal Pradesh wants, right? She represents the normal people of this region who just want the violence to stop. This is how the violence is going to stop when they agree to self-governance, right? But thirdly, right, understand that they have a massive flaw in their case because they only engage in the paradigm where Kashmir is going to be an autonomous state. In our first speech, we told you 3 levels of how Kashmir will never be able to be an autonomous state like a fulfilling democracy that they wanted to envision, right? On the first level, when Kashmir gains independence or tries to act as an independent state, the power vacuum will be filled by the separatist groups who pretend to be freedom fighters like the LET, right? These people will come into power, which will further aggravate the divide between the Muslims and the Kashmiri Pandits, a demographic ethnic divide that will completely lead to a state which will become a failed state in the first place, right? But secondly, understand how even if the LET doesn't have the power or the money to defend and create an army to defend it against China or Pakistan, both Pakistan and China want a significant part of Kashmir, right? Which I already explained to you in their first because Pakistan's primary agenda now is to gain control of this situation, is to gain control of this area. Statements that have been given out by Pakistan currently want Kashmir to be part of a Pakistani state. We think that in all of these cases, once the power vacuum isn't filled by the LET, Pakistan and China are both going to take up the west, northwest and the northeast parts of Kashmir and it will further be plagued by ethnic violence that these people don't want. To understand why it's even more problematic, right? Because the identity of Kashmir people is something that matters. Understand that they on their side homogenize the identity of Kashmir people as one whole. Understand there are 3 kinds of people that exist in Kashmir: the Kashmiri Pandits, the Muslims and the people who want to side with India. Once you make this an independent state, you create the same kind of ethnic tensions that exist between Northern Ireland, which is a part of the United Kingdom, and like the other part of Ireland, where because the border is porous currently on both sides, they don't have to take a stance on which state they want to be a part of. Now, when you actively create a third state between Pakistan and India, the Kashmiri people, some of them want to go to Pakistan and some of them want to go to India, but they also are lost in a pan identity of Kashmir, which we don't see who will ascribe to. But even beyond that, right, even if it becomes a part of the Pakistani state, there are still people who want to come to India, and this will again result in the same kind of deaths and conflicts that resulted when the Indian partition happened with Pakistan. And a large demographic wanted to move to India and a large demographic wanted to stay with Pakistan. Here's our solution, which we've been harping to you from our first speech, which they never rebutted, right? Give them the exclusive autonomy that the BJP government is already giving them in the current scenario, right? Which is giving only Kashmiri people the right to buy land and property in those cases. Under which paradigm you need to ask yourself, will ethnic culture or ethnic
So many innocent children encounters like in Kashmir. Isn't that because the army or the police is unable to differentiate between, the terrorists and the people?
Absolutely, that's exactly what I'm saying. Right? Currently, the army isn't able to differentiate. Once they accept self-governance, the army will be able to differentiate because the identity of Kashmiri isn't homogenized as separatist groups, but the identity of Kashmiris is now part of Indian citizens. Right? Now they're fighting against the LET. I don't think they've been listening to this closely, so I don't see how that response makes sense. But lastly, understand this, right? The identity of Kashmiris is extremely important in this case. Understand, the pan-Indian identity doesn't exist on a homogeneous spectrum of Hindutva, right? It exists on a multiple spectrum where you have Muslims, Sikhs and Hindus existing, which means what your Indian identity is defined by the state that you're in. Probably South India has a different Indian identity versus North India having a different Indian identity, right? We think in all of these cases, we give Kashmir significant amount of legislative and social autonomy to decide which direction the state wants to go to in terms of the identity that it wants to prioritize. These don't solve the tangible problem of violence on our side. They want you to continue to fight forever, which decreases the death toll and doesn't solve anything. We give you a plausible solution of ending a year-long conflict that is extremely plausible.
Mr. Speaker, what are the major questions that have come up through the course of today's debate, right? Firstly, the question of whether or not local self-governance is something that will really work for the Kashmiri people, firstly. And secondly, Mr. Speaker, about whether or not azadi is something that is going to work for these people, right? But before addressing these issues, let me start with a couple of departments, right? My first department is with respect to the POI I asked, right? And everybody is clear about what the POI was about, right? And Mr. Speaker, to understand and actually put down the bullshit analysis that the answer they gave to that, it's important to understand how exactly does the LET work, right? Today, especially in India, right? What is the objective of the LET, right? The objective of the LET today is not to free the people of Kashmir, right? The objective of the people of Kashmir, or the objective of the LET is to attack the country of India, right? Mr. Speaker, and this is something that they do under this garb of being Kashmiri separatists, right? And Mr. Speaker, we tell you that today, even if you want to grant them local self-governance, right? We tell you that this problem is still going to exist, right? Because Kashmir in itself is a disputed state between India and Pakistan, right? So we tell you that Pakistan will still push LET into Kashmir, right? Will still push LET into Kashmir to cause problems to India and within Kashmir as well, right? And as a result of this, what is going to happen, right? Of course, the Indian government will react, not just because there's local self-governance and people can decide whatever they want to do. That does not mean that India will not react to when its own borders are being infringed upon, right? When the security and peace of its own people is something that is being affected, right? We tell you that India is going to retaliate, right? And the very problem that we've been speaking of, right, is something that is going to continue, right? We tell you that people at the end of the day want after the fifth. And this is where the entire point about the army being unable to differentiate between the terrorists and the locals there becomes even more important, right? The very fact that today so many fake encounters happen, right? So many encounters happen where innocents absolutely die again and again and again after the fifth, sir. We tell you that, Mr. Speaker, this is the problem, right? This problem of differentiating will continue and the innocents will keep on dying, right? Coming to my second point, right, Mr. Speaker, they talked to us about Burhan Wani and the very fact that thousands and thousands of people were involved in that procession, right? Understand why exactly were these people as a part of this procession, right? Because of the fact that Burhan Wani as an individual respected the fact, was a symbol of the idea that Kashmir should be a separatist state, right? And we tell you that he was somebody who was the symbol of their demands, right? And that is the primary reason why thousands joined in. And we also agree, Mr. Speaker, they also joined in after the fifth, so I'm not taking anything, right? Mr. Speaker, we are telling you that they also joined, no denying that they also joined because of the atrocities that the army was committing, right? And we tell you that those atrocities will continue, right? Even in the paradigm, even in the local self-governance that they talk about, right? Mr. Speaker, they talk to us about this idea about how the Indian state will never give in to these demands, right? We tell you that, see, at the end of the day, look at the elections that just took place, right? Why was it that the Congress party was thrown out from there? And why is it that the BJP got such a big mandate within the Kashmir Valley, right? Because that is simply reflective of the demands of the people, right? And we tell you that the very fact that BJP was forced into aligning something for the betterment of the state, we tell you that the PDP has the soft power, maybe in the long run, to get azadi for the people, right? We tell you that this is a possibility, but they on their side have rejected this possibility and tell us why exactly that the PDP is not in such a situation, right? Mr. Speaker, my next point, right? They talk to us about the idea that once India leaves Kashmir, who's going to protect their borders, right? We tell you that from the right and from the left, we tell you that is absolute bullshit, right? Mr. Speaker, understand this, right? Today, in the case of Kosovo, right? Today, the border security is something that has been enhanced, right? From, say, Albania or from Serbia, right? Mr. Speaker, we tell you that the very fact that once Kashmir is established as a nation state, right? And is recognized by the rest of the world, right? We tell you that we can always take recourse to, say, the United Nations and other such bodies for help, right? We tell you that this is a recourse that several other countries such as Kosovo and South Sudan have taken in the past, right? And it has somehow been, helped them in some scenario, right? Mr. Speaker, they talk us about infrastructure, right? We tell you infrastructure development is not just because India is suddenly infrastructure not going to develop there, right? And why is it that India cannot help them in developing infrastructure, right? India can always help them in developing infrastructure. That means that India does not necessarily have to take over that country, but they can always help them in infrastructure development, right? And why is it that parties like the World Bank and the IMF come in, right? They are there for helping countries to rebuild themselves, right? There are several such forums that exist, right? And we tell you that the infrastructure problem is not something that exists, right? We tell you Kashmir always has the resources, and today even with the hydroelectric thing, we tell you that it is being used to, provide electricity in Punjab and all these other states, but the problem still exists in Kashmir, right? And we tell you that that is something that will be solved. all, right? Mr. Speaker, they talked to us about this entire idea about Kashmir as an independent state, independent country will be somebody who's aligned with the Pakistani state, right? And how the problem will still continue, right? Mr. Speaker, like 2 points of rebuttal to this, right? Firstly, the idea that today, when Kashmir talks about azadi, we talk about 3 separate entities, right? Pakistan, Kashmir, India, right? We tell you that they're not necessarily going to be aligned with somebody like a Pakistan, right? Because we tell you that at the end of the day, this is something that is going to harm ourselves, right? How exactly is it going to harm ourselves and should ourselves to the soul, right? The very fact that today Pakistan tries to send terrorists through Kashmir into the rest of India, and what does this create? This creates problems within our valley itself, right? So we tell you, Mr. Speaker, that the very reason we will not align with the Pakistani state and allow the terrorists is to prevent the very fact that there is something that is going to affect our own security, right? So that alignment with Pakistan is something that is not going to happen, right? Mr. Speaker, coming down to my major question, right, about whether or not local self-government will work, right? No, sir. They talked to us about, as we said, we're not taking it, right? Mr. Speaker, they spoke to us that this entire idea about, somehow the ASPA and the CRPF and the rest of these entire officials there were trying to impose security or somebody, we somehow going to respect the people and they're not going to treat them in an appropriate manner, right? We tell you that, Mr. Speaker, this is a very utopian world, right? What are you talking about? It's important to understand the problems of these people, right? Mr. Speaker, as I've already told you and as the previous two speakers told you, that even in your local welfare government state, we tell you problems that still exist. Pakistan is still going to try to push through and somehow try to get being a part of Kashmir and somehow going to try to send terrorists into India. The problems of Kashmir today, the very basic problems, will always continue, right? The same with China, right? Mr. Speaker, how exactly the insurgency work, right? With a particular objective, right? And the objective of insurgency will always continue, right? And that is not really helping the cause, right? Mr. Speaker, how exactly, Mr. Speaker, the second question, how exactly whether or not azadi is something that is going to be beneficial for the people and whether or not it will work, right? They talked to us about this entire idea about safety and security is something that won't exist, right? Because it's going to highlight against Pakistan. That is something, that's a point that I've already rebutted, right? And they tell us about this entire point about, how Pakistan will somehow hijack the Kashmiri state and continue to cause problems, right? Mr. Speaker, we told you that there are 3 points of rebuttal to this, right? Firstly, the idea of economic, on the economic front, we tell you that Kashmir is well equipped, and we tell you that even if it is not, it can always get support from other institutions and maybe India as well, right? Mr. Speaker, we tell you the very fact that it is a state, what we tell you when it comes to peace and security, it can always take resource, which is the United Nations, which is there for this fucking very purpose, right? And Mr. Speaker, at the end of the day, having said that, we're very, very proud of it.
The 2 overarching themes that you must keep in your mind: 1, does local self-governance serve the interests of the Kashmiri people? Second, in terms of identity, but on a second level, does it actually create peace in the region, which we believe is definitely wanted by them, right? And we've analyzed both of these for you. So what are the 3 questions that they've asked, and we've asked, and like some of these we don't agree on? One, they tell you, will Kashmir get azadi, and therefore should that be like a consideration, and how important is that consideration? We've challenged that on 2 levels. First, we've told you, A, that people have in the recent past, the collective conscience of the Indian community has come to a stage where they recognize the legitimate demands of Kashmir as a separate state, right? The fact that they view like Omar Abdullah's granddad being imprisoned in Delhi as an injustice, and they empathize with the sort of demands that the state has, is necessarily something that has come to be recognized. We see this happening on a greater level within the Kashmir Valley itself, where the stakeholders, the primary stakeholders in this debate, when they express their ultimate wishes through the election of the PDP, right, and the BJP goes and needs to form an alliance there in order to have some sort of semblance of power. We think in that situation, the people of Kashmir have made their desires amply clear, right? We fail to see how you suddenly ignore all ideas of what your identity is, what you fought for so long, and suddenly given to this concession that's not going to address the second question that you have, right? But we tell you, in the second situation, right, what happens to Kashmir in case of the sort of self-governance that you talk about? First, A, we don't understand what the self-governance is, right? Because Kashmir already has its own penal code. In first case, we got a different idea of self-governance. Kashmir already, only by asking to our what is the separate idea of the sort of self-governance that they're talking about, right? Which means that what do they exclusively mean, right? They mean that all policies that are going to be formed in Kashmir are going to, can you pause time for a minute, please? I can't hear us. Can you just pause time? Can you just pause time? Stopping, right? Yeah. Okay, good. So what happens, what we don't understand the sort of self-governance they're talking about because we think that already exists, right? But if their idea is that there's going to be self-governance regarding we won't give them our resources, we won't let the Indian army continue, we think that doesn't happen in self-governance, right? Because when it continues to be a part of India, when there is a breach of territorial sovereignty, for example, the Indian army is still allowed to send in their army. And if we say no, that's not going to happen, then we think that's azadi, right? Tell us how that's materially different. But on the second idea, what is the other sort of thing? We think the resources continue to remain part of the Indian state, right? Till you are a different country, you can say this river is my river because this much part close to my country. You can't have equitable distribution of resources between the states. That's still a part of India because the river at the end of the day is an Indian river and India gets to determine who gets how much water. We think the problems that the Kashmiris will face, such as like losing their resources, is primarily because of this. Because the Indian state has been able to claim certain resources that the valley could have benefited from as their own resources. Tell us how in local self-governance Kashmiris are going to become richer people when they're already poor people because of what the Indian state doesn't continue to do, right? But on the second idea, they tell you that suddenly we're going to make all decisions and how is this going to work, right? We tell you, and they tell you that people are going to be killed through the process of like this sort of azadi that we're talking about. There are two differences between what happened in India and Pakistan, right? First, there are peacekeeping forces that are far more active today and who actively help in partition scenarios all over the world. We don't think there's going to be the sort of bloodshed that like this massive matter dumping Govt comes from, right? But on the second level, we think that there's a lot more emotional maturity today, right? And we're going to rebut that when we tell you that why is it materially different? Why do they tell you that if China's going to invade, we're not going to have a position of power? For the simple reason that, hey, Nigam tells you there are GA resolutions, right? Why did this not happen in case of Russia? Because we find that USA did not have enough incentive. When this happens with the case of China, USA has enough incentive to go ahead and push for the sort of GA resolution that you can use to take action against China. Something that comes up in Govt, give it to us early so we can rebut it faster, right? But what happens in the sort of azadi? We've tackled China, but they tell you that Pakistan comes in and kills people, right? We tell you, Pakistan coming in and killing people is not because they want to kill Kashmiris, it's because they want to annoy India, because they think that India has taken territory that's legitimately theirs. We think this sort of solution doesn't happen in local self-governance, right? Because the aim of Pakistan still continues. They still send in insurgents. Everything that happens in status quo continues to happen. Tell us how that's different, right? We tell you what happens when interests don't align, right? And they tell us Scotland initiative exactly, right? The interests of Kashmiri people aren't the same that the Indians themselves want. And we think the sort of demonization that has happened of Kashmiri people necessarily means that they're going to get the sort of hate from Indians the moment they say we're not okay with this. Tell us why as the Kashmiri people we should agree to be part of a nation that treats us subserviently and means that we can give concessions to, and therefore
continue to exist, that Afspa is going to continue to plague these people with problems. Which begs the question of what exactly does azadi solve, or what exactly does azadi actually change within Kashmir today? Because we think at no point have they ever dealt with the paradigm of how directly this sort of a freedom is going to happen, right? Because we told you right from the top that the kind of independent, autonomous and sovereign state that they speak about isn't really going to happen considering the geopolitical power dynamics that continues to plague the region, where Kashmir is divided into bits and pieces among different actors that want to fight for it, right? Which means we have to evaluate this debate on, first of all, the kind of principle that they were pushing on us, right? They said initially, and this is something that they dropped later, that the only reason why we need to continue to fight for azadi is because of some sort of Kashmiri identity that needs to be kept intact, and that's something that our forefathers fought for. Even if this was something that's true, we pointed out that it's incredibly reductionist of them to simplify the identities of several, like hundreds of thousands of people to one, right? And we tell you the simple fact that there exist different factions and different groups of people means that they want different things, which means they can't assess this debate in terms of saying that they want to preserve a Kashmiri identity when the Kashmiri identity is itself something that's divided between Muslims, between Pandits and things like that, right? But which means that in terms of principle, they haven't really won this debate. But in terms of likelihood, right, whether the fight for azadi is actually going to fruition into change. Now they gave us like two sorts of weird bits of responses, right? First of all, something about how the collective Indian conscience has decided that they've realized that Kashmir ought to be a separate state, and the second, that apparently the PDP has enough leverage to like untwist the BJP into letting this actually happen. Now this is something that we pointed out right from the first speech, right? The BJP is willing to engage with Kashmir as a state only at the point at which they go through mechanisms of legislative and parliamentary change and tools of diplomacy. That isn't going to happen at a point at which they continue to fight for azadi, which has resulted in more combative and more violent mechanisms in itself. And then third idea, right, and this is something that was particularly problematic. The reason for why this is likely to happen is because apparently, since every day we're giving Kashmir more and more concessions, and since this is pissing people off more, the only way to actually appease the people is to like kind of let Kashmir go altogether. Now that has to be argued vis-a-vis what we told you in terms of why BJP is unlikely to relinquish control, right? For several reasons. We told you why they don't want to be seen as giving concessions entirely to a fundamentally Muslim state in the event that it does secede. And also, we told you why this is unlikely to happen in a scenario where the conflict is no longer within the confines of a single nation, but moves on to international borders, right? And this is something that they pushed us on, right? They said that, look, Pakistan is going to continue to push insurgents into Kashmir and the LET is going to continue to plague the area with violence. So that begs the question of, Mr. Speaker, what does really happen under their scenario when they do fight for azadi if they claim that this is going to continue to happen? Versus what we told you, right? We told you that this changes the narrative in terms of how people view the army and how the army view people in itself. We told you that the army no longer views these people as separatists and as people who are necessarily fighting for freedom, and the people no longer view them as aggressors at the point at which their sole duty is to protect the people of Kashmir from outside forces. Which means even if we were to buy their assumption that the LET is going to continue to exist, the army can now actually protect them. They cannot appeal to the United Nations and win this debate on examples, because for every 3 examples they give us of where the UN might have been like somewhat effective, we have more to show you why it's unlikely to happen. But the weirdest idea coming from them was the idea that they still have support structures from the Indian government to help them out. At the point at which, Mr. Speaker, Kashmir secedes and has an independent state of its own, we see no reason why India has an incentive to actually keep them out. Rather, what we told you about in the way that the power vacuum manifests itself is that it isn't going to be autonomous to the degree that they speak about, right? Because Pakistan has made statements as recent as today to suggest that the only thing that's important to them is freedom of Kashmir. But the way that this freedom manifests is over control over the territory, where we already see China fighting for regions of Kashmir in itself. We told you why the only way to end this violence is to promote a system of local self-governance. For these reasons,